Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give folks a couple minutes to log in. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give folks another minute or two to log in. Sorry about that. Keep going to the next slide. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give folks just one more minute before we get started. Great. Well, I'll get a couple more people coming in the waiting room. Okay, here we go. Great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And Bryn will be helping us admit folks and keep folks muted. So welcome, good evening, and welcome to Who Governs the Governor's Council. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jen Miroff, and I'm the chair of the Legislative Action Committee for the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. We're pleased to host this event in partnership with the advocacy group Who Governs the Governor's Council. I'm going to share a slide with their website, whogovernsthegc.org. This is what it looks like, and we'll be sharing resources regarding Who Governs the Governor's Council at the end of the presentation, and we'll also be sharing them out tomorrow along with the recording. Great. So next, we'd like to share some community norms. We'd like everyone to be kind and be respectful, assume positive intent, bring your full self and limit distractions. Use the chat feature to ask questions during the Q&A section, and message staff with any private comments or concerns. And first, some housekeeping items. This event is being recorded. The slide deck contains resources and more links for more information, and both will be posted to our website tomorrow, lwvma.org. Please stay muted while not speaking to avoid distractions. And we want to be attentive to your questions, so please save your questions until the end, as your question may be answered by one or more of the speakers. You can enter them into the chat when the panel has finished. The League of Women Voters of Massachusetts is a 104-year-old nonpartisan political organization comprised of 3,000 active members across 43 local leagues and 147 municipalities. The League does not endorse candidates or political parties, but we do take positions on issues after thorough study and consensus. In accordance with our mission to empower voters, we are pleased to host this education event tonight. This is not a campaign event or candidate forum. Please refrain from all campaign activity in the chat. We will share information related to local league candidate forums at the end of the event. The League of Women Voters of Massachusetts works to enact policies to end domestic violence involving all segments of the criminal justice system. This session, the League advocated for a bill to add 8 family court judges passed in the FY24 budget to relieve the heavy caseload and burden of family court. And we are all thrilled that Massachusetts is now the 8th state to add the definition of coercive control to the definition of domestic violence within an act to end abuse and exploitation. And we want to say a special thank you and shout out to the Hoc Coalition, Together Rising Above Coercion, and the Massachusetts Family Advocacy Organization, who worked with us very hard to get this bill passed. And it is a wonderful feat. As we all know, it was filed this session and it actually passed this session. So that's amazing, and it's going to help so many families. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed panel. I'm going to stop share for a second. David Harris, Emeritus Managing Director of the Charles Hamilton Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School. Jean Trounstine, author, activist, and professor who writes about the Governor's Council and Parole for the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism. And Nancy Bettinger, League of Women Voters of Massachusetts Criminal Legal System Legislative Specialist. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy, who's going to be talking to us about what the Governor's Council is, just some basics. And I'm going to share my screen again with those slides.
Thank you, Jen, and thank all of you for being here tonight. So just to be sure that everyone here understands what the council is all about, I'll just take about 5 minutes to cover the basics. So the Governor's Council's main responsibility, and I would say most important responsibility, is to provide advice and consent on the governor's appointments, which include the positions on this list. They interview the candidates and recommend whether or not they should be appointed. And taken all together, these appointees have very broad powers to make decisions that affect many, many people's lives. So to give you a sense of that, I'll just give you a few examples of the work that's done by the judges appointed in different courts. So next slide. Probate and family court judges make decisions about divorce, settlements, child custody and support, adoption, guardianships, and ending parental rights. Juvenile court judges are responsible for protecting children from abuse and neglect and ensuring that juveniles who are involved in the legal system are held accountable, but at the same time receive support for rehabilitation. District court judges hear a range of cases, including housing disputes, mental health related cases, some juvenile cases, and they actually have the power to commit a person involuntarily to drug or alcohol treatment facility for up to 90 days. Superior court judges hear criminal cases, including first degree and murder cases. And the Supreme Judicial Court is really the court of last resort when a person wishes to appeal a lower court decision in Massachusetts. The council has a huge impact on the criminal legal system in addition to the judicial appointments. For example, the parole board members decide whether eligible incarcerated people are ready to be granted parole. The council also recommends whether people who have petitioned to be pardoned or have their sentences reduced should be granted clemency by the governor. So it's extremely important to ensure that the appointees are not only highly qualified, that's a minimum requirement, but also unbiased and empathetic and capable of wise and fair judgments. On the next slide, this covers how the counselors are selected. Each counselor is elected for a 2-year term from one of 8 districts, so there are 8 counselors altogether. The districts are redrawn every 10 years after the national census. In addition to the 8, the lieutenant governor is automatically a member of the council. So on the next slide, this is a list of the current council members, and I'll just let you read through those later at your leisure. And the next slide is a map showing the locations, the current locations of the districts from which the counselors are elected. And in the resource slide at the end, you'll find a link to a list of towns that make up each district. And finally, the next slide has information on how you can listen in on council meetings. Council meets every Wednesday in the State House, and all hearings and appointees are open to the public. They start either at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock p.m. That should be announced on their website. And there's a link on this slide that you can use to hear live streamed meetings of the council. So those are the basics. If there are any questions, we'll be happy to take them at the end. But now I'm going to Jen is going to lead a panel on a panel discussion on some different aspects of the council. So back over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Nancy. Great. So now we'll be introducing and hearing from our esteemed panelists, David Harris and Jean Trounstine. And we know from the series from 2022, what a difference a DA makes, how important it is to educate voters on all the races on our ballots. And we will be showing you a sample ballot that shows you where the governor's council candidates are listed. Right now, they're listed as counselor, and it's not clear that we're talking about the governor's counselor, but we know that those education events 2 years ago made a difference. What a difference a DA makes. We knew that voters were educated on those races and kept a close eye on those candidates and what was important to them, specifically to racial justice overall. And we know that at the League, we are committed to racial justice across all of our issues. We focus on a racial justice lens. We work on affordable housing all the way through to transportation, and every bill that we support in the legislature definitely is impacted by systemic racism. And that's why we're here tonight to hear from our esteemed colleagues. So first, I'd like to turn it over to David to offer an overview.
Thank you so much, Jen. And I want to say, after our last session, I was reminded by another colleague of mine that in addition to what a difference a DA makes, several years ago, there was a group called the Hoc Coalition to Stop New Jails in Massachusetts, which did a similar kind of campaign about sheriffs. And we're clearly indebted to the many activists before us who sought to inform the public and electorate about pressing issues, often overlooked by the press itself. On behalf of the dozen or so folks who've been working on this project, I want to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting us here. We wanted to make sure that we could reach a statewide audience, and we were committed to a nonpartisan approach to educating the public on the Governor's Council. We couldn't have found a better partner, and we're just so deeply grateful. And I want to thank you all for being with us tonight. The Governor's Council predates the formation of the nation. In colonial times, its members were drawn from land-owning white men, and they held considerable sway in the affairs of the colony. One of the earliest members was none other than Isaac Royal, an enslaver of Black people on his Medford estate, whose wealth derived from the Antiguan sugar plantation. We've come a long way from the enslavement in Medford, and the council itself has diminished in power. In theory, it is more democratic, no longer the preserve of wealthy white men. But there's a sad through line from Isaac Royal to today. Namely, in its 400-year history, there has been, to our knowledge, only one Black councilor, Michael Murphy, elected in 1991. Given the structure of the council, that Murphy was elected is a remarkable feat. In districts made up of 5 Senate seats, the likelihood of electing a Black councilor is slim indeed. And that brings me to why these elections are so important. Just as happens in any at-large election, the odds are stacked, right, against minority group members representing tiny proportions of the electorate. At the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice, we developed what we called community justice. It grew out of years of wrestling with the problems facing people of color and others who have been denied the dual aspects of citizenship, membership, and participation in society. It was based on an understanding of justice meaning to be made whole, and it applied to communities as well as individuals. One of the goals was to increase membership and participation for those who had been denied. Another was to make communities themselves whole, and to do so by highlighting the knowledge, experience, and determination of affected residents in identifying problems, designing and crafting solutions, implementing and evaluating policies. We recognized that in a society that was willing to treat corporations as citizens for the purposes of election, it was cynical, bordering on cruel, to expect those who have been denied citizenship to trust the electoral process to make them or their communities whole. We recognize the right to vote with your feet by taking to the streets and the seats of power in protest. Our notion of community justice was born from the sobering realization that our previous formulation, which asked, what kind of society are we that is willing to treat so many people unfairly and unequally, was quite simply grammatical fiction. They were fiction. It was a fiction born of we the people, the notion that our governance and its institutions represented all of us, even those excluded from membership. Community and justice was meant to include all of us in we the people. It's also born from an understanding of systems of inequality, systems that go well beyond the well-meaning or antipathy of individuals, systems that are established and sustained without question or challenge, and that operate with a certain invisibility. I would submit to you that the Governor's Council is one such body, a critical part of the legal system that has brought us and maintained the system of mass incarceration under which we continue to operate. I repeat, this is not about any individual, it's about a system in which 8 individuals are elected and charged with deciding the makeup of our judiciary, as well as the parole and commutations, along with other responsibilities. For the previous event, we asked respondents who registered who represented them on the Governor's Council. It may have seemed like a gratuitous question, but it's a stand-in for more important ones. We could have asked, how many of you have ever met your counselor? How many of you have ever had the opportunity to talk to your counselor, to share your concerns, or to assess their performance? And speaking of performance, how many of you know how they have voted throughout or even for any part of their careers on the council? I'm willing to go out on a limb here and speculate that few of you could answer many of these questions. Indeed, when I question just who the we represented by the Governor's Council, I'm pointing to the relatively few people who vote for this down ticket office, identified on the ballot, as Jen said, as simply as counselor, or who cast a vote with knowledge of the candidate's record. The truth is that this body represents a very small segment of the electorate, let alone the Commonwealth, and it holds on to this representation with relative ease, incumbency being the strongest qualification. Year after year, many, if not most incumbents run unopposed, and if opposed, win by significant margin. To be sure, the first election may be contested, but the path after that remains clear. The Governor's Council may well be the least representative body in the Commonwealth. I'm not criticizing individuals here, I'm criticizing a system, and I'm criticizing us for not being better citizens, members and participants, and demanding more from these elected officials. Indeed, it could well be that they would welcome more contact from us, more guidance from us on our concerns about how to judge candidates and make decisions on our behalf. If counselors are expected to relate more actively with their constituents, we might attract a broader array of candidates to the office. Indeed, there are some counselors doing this now. As you know, the Governor's Council votes on judges and parole board members. For the moment, we'll not focus on these nominees, how these nominees come to be, but they have the opportunity to question the candidates, decide whether they are qualified, and whether they meet whatever criteria or goals for office a counselor might have for that position. As we'll hear from Jean, this questioning almost never results in rejection of candidates. This has certainly been striking and disturbing on the parole board, which for years has been overrepresented by members of the legal and law enforcement profession. This seems to be changing a bit, due in no small part to the tireless work of advocates like Jean and my colleague who reminded me of the sheriff's campaign. But I want to close by talking about judges. Last week, the People's Parity Project, a nonprofit organization which describes itself as, quote, a movement of attorneys and law students organizing for a democratized legal system which values people over profits, builds the power of working people, and opposes subordination in any form. It released a report entitled Imbalanced Justice, Massachusetts. Their research revealed that, quote, the state judiciary is filled with ex-corporate lawyers and prosecutors, and corporate attorneys dominate the judicial nominating commission. They described the Governor's Council as, quote, serving as a rubber stamp for the chief executive. Who is holding them accountable for this? It's time for us to demand that the Governor's Council become more proactive rather than simply reactive. I'm urging all of us to do as I've urged others whose membership and participation are denied, diminished, or muted. Use all of your votes at the ballot box to be sure, but also the phone, the mailbox, the inbox to communicate to your counselor. Let them know you care, that you're paying attention, that you want them to represent your interests rather than use a position as their personal platform. You may recall that the office is only identified as counselor on your ballot. There was a bill this year to correct this by using the full name Governor's Council. Sadly, as with so many other things, it failed. But it will come up again, and when it does, you can strike a blow by contacting your legislator to approve it. I repeat, there are many systems at work in maintaining the injustices in our society. It will take a long time to dismantle them, but we can and must step up and step in whenever and wherever we can, with a particular attention to hidden institutional forces like the Governor's Council. We're hoping that you will join us in resounding answer to our nominal query. We, the people, all the people, govern the Governor's Council. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, David. And now we'll turn it over to Jean.
Thank you, Jen. David, I just so appreciate your insight and your overview on things. You really, and I've said this, since David and I have been working on trying to expose things about the Governor's Council. I guess it's been over a year now since we started our project, Who Governs the Governor's Council. But I want to say that David brings such a large view picture to the whole thing, and always helps me understand things more clearly. And Jen, thank you so much for hosting this, and to the League of Women Voters. As David said, we really appreciate being partners with you. So I come to this as a writer and an observer. I probably have been to 25 or 30 Governor's Council meetings over the years. And as also a Parole Watch member, I've gone to Parole Watch hearings Parole Board hearings. And I have been someone who has wanted to be a watchdog for a lot of these processes, and to put my insight into practice. And so I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've written about, some of the things that are on our website, and hopefully help you get a little bit into the specifics. So what I would like to say is I have an article that should be coming out tomorrow. We will probably be including this with the resources, but for those of you who did not see the first article, which was called about governing in the darkness, about the Governor's Council, this is part 2, and part 3 will be out next week. So the issues which I have noticed, I'm going to give them to you ahead of time, and then I'll get into some specifics. First of all, bad behavior of the counselors toward each other and to the public, what I call backroom deals, a lack of transparency, including no posting of rules or procedures for the public and no published meeting minutes. And of course, as David mentioned, an incredible lack of diversity on the council, which is a manifestation of the structural racism of the council, uncontested elections, and conflicts of interest that come up and make us question certain ethical issues. So I'm going to give you a few anecdotes to illustrate these points. The first time I testified before the Governor's Council was as a member of an organization, Coalition for Effective Public Safety, and I was testifying against a parole board nominee. And it was very interesting to go before the council. You walk into this room, it's a very beautiful room. This is before you could even watch on live stream when COVID changed things a bit. You walked into room 360, and there was the Governor's Council, looking like they were right out of 1640 in this room. And I started to mention why I thought this particular parole board nominee should not be on the board. And I was immediately scolded by a member of the council. I was scolded for not knowing her and coming to speak about her. And I had come to speak about her because she represented law enforcement, and I thought we needed more social workers on the council. The Governor's Council, right from the beginning, struck me as incredibly rude. They were not necessarily the clown committee at that point. They've been called a sideshow filled with school children. They've been called a den of patronage. They've been called, as David mentioned, a rubber stamp body. They've been called a hock shop. They've been called dysfunctional. They've been called anachronism. I also call them rude. They walk out of the room, they use their cell phones while you're speaking, they interrupt each other, they interrupt the testifiers. They are a body that is embarrassingly not civil. And I think if you go to see the Governor's Council or if you watch them on YouTube, you cannot help but notice that. Now with the Governor's Council being streamed, you can see the council, but of course you cannot see the counselors speaking. You can only see the testifiers. You can only see the nominees. Intentional, I believe, so that you don't see things like people using their phones. Another thing that I have noticed about the council is that people change their votes without, even though they might pledge to their constituents they're voting a certain way, they change them. Why they change them? Who knows? It's not clear what they're getting. It's not clear if there are some deals being made. We can tell that the governor is very involved. One thing I need to mention to you, that the organization that I write for, Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, we did a very big deep dive and found out that of Baker's term, there were 350 nominees. The counselors voted to approve all but one, and 5 people withdrew their nominations. That is my point, that people withdraw their nominations if they think they won't be approved. There isn't a lack of transparency with all of this. How the Judicial Nominating Commission gets judges, I wrote about that in part 1 of my article, and I refer you again, as David mentioned, to the People's Parity Project report. 60% being prosecutors, 60% of Massachusetts judges are ex-prosecutors, and only 3% worked as public defenders. 2% worked as legal aid for legal aid organizations that help poor people in civil matters, and nearly half of Commonwealth judges are former corporate lawyers. The council refuses to tell us how they make decisions about who they will vote for. The process of voting yay or nay, it's not spelled out. Yes, some counselors are beginning to hold forums with their constituents to explain things. That is a newer development. I will be writing about that as well. But most of the counselors do not do this. They don't hold forums. They are not accountable to their constituents. Sometimes they don't even answer the phone when their constituents call, or answer emails when their constituents write to them. A shocking thing is that many aspects of the council have not been brought into the 21st century. They do not have digitized voting, so that when they vote on judges, for example, they're marked down, so that when you go to the council office to find out who votes for which judges, you have to go through files and files to find out. That's how we found out the 350 of the 350 nominees. I think there were 225 judges. We had to go through all of those files individually. Why we don't have in 2024 digitized voting, I can't tell you. We have not been able to get an answer on that. The racial inequities show up in many ways. They show up particularly when there are hearings and you get to listen to some of the things that counselors say. For example, at a hearing for Dr. Charlene Bonner, who happens to have have adopted a Black son, she was accused by a counselor of her racial inequities in her voting. She was also questioned about the parole board and how it voted on several different cases that had to do with drug issues. And I won't mention any particular names of counselors, but I will say it is somewhat shocking to see and listen to these kinds of things. This is why I encourage you to go to a hearing. As a member of a Massachusetts constituent, I think you owe it to yourself. I remember when David Harris walked into his first hearing and I was sitting there, he looked at me like I have never seen anything like this before. And it is somewhat shocking to see them talk. I want to say, Jen, I have a few more minutes. Yeah, 2-minute warning. That when you go to these hearings, the counselors have meetings at 12 o'clock. That's what Nancy was referring to, where they vote. They have a meeting every Wednesday at 12. The actual hearings for nominees could be at 10 to whenever they choose. But if you go at 12 o'clock, you will see them do a Pledge of Allegiance and you will see them do a prayer in the same meeting where they do a prayer that day. So conflicts of interest abound. Ethical issues abound. I encourage you to read my binge articles and you'll find out more about that. And I'm interested in all of the questions you have. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jean. So David and Jean, I'm going to spotlight you and then we definitely have a lot to think about. You've given us a lot of food for thought. As league members, we are experts in being observers at many meetings at the local, state, and national level. So we encourage all our members to be observers to the Governor's Council. That is wonderful. So where to begin? There are many members that we have here tonight who are hosting and planning candidate forums in the coming weeks. And so we wanted to give special attention to those events And the first question is, what is the number one question that the candidate should be asked? So if the local league is hosting a candidate forum, there are 2 or 3 or 4 candidates in the primary. I know in my district, what's the number one question that the League of Women Voters members should be asking?
I'll let you go first, Jim. I'm gonna let you go first.
The number one question, this is hard.
Yeah, it is.
Let's see. Can I just give a few questions? Because I think that would be a little easier for me.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I think you should ask, why do you want to be on the governor's council? Number one, what I will tell you that having researched a lot of these counselors, many of them don't say why they want to be on the council, but you can read between the lines. I think you need to get direct answers. Why do you want to be on the council? I would ask that. I would ask, what do you think your participation in the council, what would you bring to the council that might change it? And along with that is, what do you think, how do you think the council needs to be changed, or does it need to be changed? Okay, those are my 3 questions, David.
So yeah, I mean, I would echo those. I think the question about why a candidate wants to be a counselor is critical. I think that if a person answers that, and answers honestly, you could probably tell a lot about the candidate. For me, I think there are very specific questions about representation. What do you see as your role in representing your constituents? Do you feel that your constituents, that you're obligated in some way to act and vote on behalf of your constituents? And how will you know what it is your constituents want? Right? I think asking those kinds of questions are critical, because basically saying, what's the pathway to accountability for you? What do you see as your responsibility? I think, and I do wonder how many of them have thought about this and given the opportunity to think about it, what they would say. So then, and I'll just close with this. I would say, are you willing to pledge to share your votes with your constituents? Are you willing to be in regular contact with your constituents? As I was getting ready for today, I realized I've never received one, that I can remember, one correspondence from my governor's counselor, not even asking for my vote. Not even so, which is mind-boggling, right? So I think that's what I would say. I think that I hope the forums will raise questions about responsibility and accountability.
Excellent, thank you. And just to note, I received 2 full-size mailers today from candidates in my district asking for my vote, which is a first.
Good.
I had never noticed it before, so that's great.
Well, that's great.
I think it's interesting that when they're running, they ask for your vote. I think it's also interesting when they're on the council, they don't communicate about how they're voting. So those are 2 interesting points.
Definitely. And now we're going to invite folks, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat and we will ask our panelists to respond. In the interim, you talked about, you both mentioned, I know David mentioned, historically, people have called for the governor's council to be abolished. So given that we cannot abolish it today or in the next couple of years, what is the most important reform that could be enacted?
Well, Jane, do you want me to? I mean, I'll say a couple of things, but well, first of all, the low-hanging fruit the easiest thing is to correct the ballot, okay? To correct the ballot so that people know that they're voting for a governor's council. I think there are a couple of things that Jean mentioned. I think bringing the governor's council into the 21st century, and I don't mean just by Zoom, I mean by being able to digitize its records in ways that are available and accessible to the public, critical. I think there needs to, I think they need to, you know, and Jane can probably speak to this even more forcefully. I think there's probably a need for some kind of code of ethics. I think there's a need for us to seek greater transparency, and how, you know, how to do that, I don't know, but it's a process, and I think we should be engaged in trying to figure out how to do that. So and there are probably other things, but you know, and just to the underlying question about abolishing it. I mean, the problem with abolishing it is kind of what we'd replace it with, and we can have a different conversation about what the options are. But Jean, what do you think?
Well, I want to speak to two things that you just mentioned, David. Well, first of all, in part 2 of my article, I'm going to discuss in great detail the rules and ethics. And I actually call them in the article hollow rules and, you know, the problem of ethical issues. And for example, I will mention, what about all of these attorneys who are appearing before judges that they voted on? Is there an ethical issue there? And I discussed that at length. I think that's really worth thinking about. These things are not spelled out, as David just mentioned. There are no, the governor's counselors have to take, like all state employees, a test, which they call a code of ethics, which I had to take as a professor at Middlesex Community College working for the state. We had to see if there were conflicts of interest, they call it, a conflict of interest, but it really didn't deal with the kind of ethical issues that we're talking about that counselors face. Also, there are rules which they have recently updated from 1993. I mean, just recently, as in 2023, say very little about anything that is meaningful. They are procedural. They are not about the kinds of behaviors and the kinds of things that you and I would want if we were talking about what does the governor's council do and how does it do it. Not spelled out. So I think those things are extremely important. Also, I want to say that the governor's council owes it to people, my opinion. The governor's council owes it to its constituents to explain itself. I mean, I wouldn't feel that I could go in front of my students and not explain how I judged them in my course, or how I, you know, what I was going to give them and why I was going to give it to them. My students wouldn't accept that. Why does the governor's council act in a shroud of darkness?
So, and Jen, if I could just amplify one thing that Jean is saying, you know, Jean did comment on my response and my reaction the first time I walked in, and it was astounding, and I echo her suggestion that you all look at some of the behaviors that we're talking about. But I think, and what you will see if you do that, I think, is you will see 8 people who perform, and I can't think of any other word for it, to their own script. And I think that there's no indication that performance is anything other than their own individual script. And I think that's problematic. I mean, so I think I would, if you tuned in and watched your governor's council and how that person acts, performs, behaves, speaks, and ask yourself, is that person speaking for me? Just very simply. I think you might be a little distressed. But that's away from the questions, Jen. I'm sorry.
No, that was
No,
really
that's wonderful.
David.
My head is just swimming with so many ideas and ways for voters to get involved. So I thank you for all those recommendations for local leagues as they run candidate forums in the next week or so. Do you have a sense of what happens in other states? What is happening in other states related to this type of body?
Well, I can say that there is only one other state in the nation which has a governor's council, and that is New Hampshire. Their council is not as well, it's not exactly like ours, but it does bring us to the question of what would happen if the governor's council was abolished, which is kind of where you started with this. And I think that people through the years, and I wrote about this in part 1 of my article, through the years, people have said, they've tried to come up with solutions. They suggested the Senate, they suggested a body of people that they, like with the Attorney General and a few other officials in the state to approve all of these positions. And yet nothing has stuck, nothing has held. And I want to say that the question of reforming the council is really an important one. And I think we all need to think about that. David has great ideas in terms of community justice. I think his ideas are terrific. I've heard different people come up with, change the people, not the process, or change the process, not the people. That's why we have elections. Do we want to get new blood? Do we want to get new people into the process? But it's a big question and people need to think about it. What would you do after you observe the governor's council? And I think it needs some observation. What do you think? What do we need to do to make it a more democratic body?
Well, so, and Jen, so in terms of the other states, as Jean said, one other state has a governor's council. 37 states elect judges. Is that right?
37 elect judges, and they elect them in all different kinds of ways.
So, but there's and I think in those that don't have a governor's council and don't elect judges, I think they mostly look to their legislatures, right, or pieces of their legislatures, and so we have to ask ourselves about our legislature. Is it the body we think would be better than the governor's council? I mean, I hate to put it so crudely, but so I think I think that's really the only alternative, and so I think we need to. So as we think about whether to reform this body or scuttle it, we need to think about what the alternative is, and I think so. There are many different things, Jen. I think that so the other thing about the governor's council that is just totally bizarre is that each district includes 5 Senate districts, and the districts themselves are so peculiarly constituted that it's difficult to say how one can speak of representing the district because the interests are so varied across those districts.
David, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I wanted to just go back to one thing before we get into the districts, which I think is really important about reforming. I wanted to mention there are some people who have other ideas about reforming the council. And one idea is to not elect counselors the way we elect them. And that is an idea that's out there John Griffin, I'm going to write about him as well. It's not actually, it's a little bit confusing, but it's not about electing, particularly considering that nobody even understands that there are people being elected most of the time, because they don't necessarily turn over their ballot to see the word counselor on the other side, which they don't even know what it means. So there are some other ways of thinking of reforming, and I would say that's important. I want to bring that to people's attention too. So I'm sorry, back to your district. David, you're right about the districts.
No.
They're ridiculously drawn.
Yeah. And I don't know how to resolve that, but I think if that becomes part of our, I mean, I think that can be part of a conversation, right? Anyway, I think, Jen, that's leave it at that.
Right. And in an effort to observe the council, this is a question from an audience member. Do you think it's important to appear in person at the State House in the room number, or is Zoom okay? I mean, we do span Cape Cod to the Berkshires, so most of our members, potentially are virtual. However, what do you recommend?
I'll take that one because I've done both. I mean, the ideal is not necessarily the real in this case. So I would say ideally, it's good to walk in that room because you see more and you see the process in a really up close way. But I think you can get a lot out of Zoom. We have one member of who governs the Governor's Council who has went to 11 Zoom meetings and wrote up notes, and they were extraordinary in terms of what she observed. So I would say if you observe with an eye to the fact that you are not necessarily seeing the counselors. You might not know who they are. It takes a while to learn their voices. It's different than if you actually go in person and you can see them. You'll be just hearing them on Zoom. That is the downside. And you'll see the people who are testifying. Every once in a while, they will, the camera allows you to see the counselors, but not that often. I would say if you're going to observe, one thing to do would be go to a 12 o'clock assembly meeting where you can see all the counselors, and then you would get to know them, and you'd get to know them with their voices. That is because in the assembly, they're all shown on camera.
So I would say, I realize it's difficult, and I think that this is a truism. I think real life is actually always. I'd much rather be in a room with all of you people, right? I think it would be a different experience. I think, Jean is right. You can see, you can get a sense, but you need to be in the room to see the dynamics. No, really, the inattention, the way the interactions. I think on the Zoom, you don't really get a sense of the expressions on their faces and how they're treating the witnesses. And you also, the other thing about being there in person, if you can get there at all, is to see how many people are there in the audience, right? I mean, the people go to these meetings and show up. And so Jean's right. I mean, if you can watch one, you can get a sense of what's going on Zoom, but if it's not terribly inconvenient, I would encourage people to try to get there. I think it's important for them to have people in the room too, for the governor, for the council, to know that there are people watching, that there are people, who care enough to be there.
I agree with you. We agree with you, from your local housing authority, just observing all the way through to congressional hearings. We've done it all. So we agree. We wholeheartedly agree. And I just wanted to invite you to offer any final remarks before we go ahead and show folks what their ballot will look like. If you'd like to offer any additional statements, we want to thank you. We're very grateful for your partnership and all the work you do, and we look forward to collaborating further.
I would like to say, if anybody wants more information about the Governor's Council, please go to the Who Governs the GC website and look at that website, and please feel free to contact us, contact me, contact David, contact Laura Berland, Lisa Berland, who are on the website. I would be happy to be a resource for anyone who would like to learn more about the Governor's Council, and happy to share any information I have with you.
So I'm going to close. I'm a little worried about artificial intelligence and who's going to be watching this video. But you know, one of the things I need to clarify and make really sure that I'm clear on is why I think this is the kind of racial dimension to this. Okay, and it is, you know, this interesting critical race theory. There's a thing called convergence theory, and it's the idea that one of the reasons that certain civil rights, certain victories occur is because of a convergence between the goals and interests of the larger society and those of civil rights and racial justice activists. And that, you know, there's an analysis of the civil rights movement along those lines in terms of the national politics and how it kind of coincided with the interests of the civil rights activists. And I think in this particular instance, the interests of the electorate, broadly speaking, converge with the interests of people of color to change the composition and conduct of the Governor's Council. And so I say it's really critically important. I said in the last time, you know, if you believe that Black Lives Matter, and if you believe that you want to participate in being the change you're seeking, I think this is a way to do it. I think that changing the nature of the Governor's Council not only serves you as a resident of the Commonwealth better, it serves those who have been excluded better.
That was beautiful. Thank you. We're here for it. So I'll thank you again, and then I'm going to be sharing my slides. So thank you again to our panelists, David Harris and Jean Trounstine. I just wanted to offer a few quick reminders that elections are on the way. As we all know, we're working hard on our candidate forums. The primary is Tuesday, September 3rd, and early voting, mail-in voting begins August 24th. The general election is Tuesday, November 5th, with early voting and mail-in voting options beginning on October 19th. There are several candidate forums. The recording is available for District 2 that was sponsored by Sharon Stoughton, Needham, and Dover Sherborne. That recording is available for District 2 candidates. District 3 event is being held on August 15th. It's sponsored by a long list of leagues, thankfully, which is wonderful. That's going to be on August 15th. That's going to be recorded by New TV in Newton and available on all of these websites and via the local cable access channel. And District 4 is sponsored by LWV Boston and Hingham, and that's for the general election. So that date is TBD, but we will keep you posted. And we wanted to make sure that everyone's visiting Vote 411, which is our elections tool. All the information you need is at vote411.org. That is the League of Women Voters platform, and we have solicited feedback from all the Governor's Council candidates. So if they've completed their questionnaires, they will be within Vote 411, so you can see everything that's on your ballot there. Additionally, I wanted to share my specific ballot for the primary in the 2nd district. The arrow shows you that Governor's Counselor, as of right now, says counselor. So not everyone is sure what that means. That actually means Governor's Counselor. So in our mission to educate voters, we want to make sure you're telling everyone you know, everyone who lives in your house, your neighbors, your friends, your family, everyone you know, please make sure they know where Governor's Counselor is on their ballot, because it is a little tricky because you're not sure what's going on there. So please educate everyone you can about where this falls on their ballot. This ballot is for, I think, the Republican primary, and I wanted to show you the Democratic primary as well. So here's the blue arrow that shows you for the 2nd district all the folks that are running. And we are going to share these slides, and the recording will be posted to our website tomorrow. But please visit Who Governs the Governor's Council. We shared the slide at the beginning that shows you the link in the website, and we invite you to contact them directly for ways to get involved and make a change. And let's see if I have any more slides here. Here are more resources, Secretary of State Elections Division, where you can see all the candidates running. And David mentioned at the start of the event about the People's Parity Project, and that's another wonderful resource that we'd like to share with you. And that's that. So with that, I'm going to stop my share. I wanted to thank everyone for attending tonight. We hope you will reach out with any questions, and thank you again and take care. Good night.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you very